I come to the Senate floor to tell my colleagues why I support the issue of cap and cut and balance. On August the 2nd, our nation will be unable to borrow money to meet our current obligations. We've known for a while that this was coming. Our annual deficits have been near $1.5 trillion for the past 2 years, and it's going to be that large this year as well. With deficits of that size, no one should be surprised that we've hit the debt ceiling. Which raises the question then, what has the President offered to confront this looming crisis? I ask that question because people expect a president to lead, and we have an executive budget and an executive budget law since, I think, the 1920s has put the president in a lead on these issues. So I ask another question, what has the Senate Democratic majority done to address our deficit crisis? Because it is the responsibility of a majority to present a budget to the Congress of the United States, and we have not had a budget resolution for more than 800 days now. So I think you can draw the conclusion whether or not it's the President of the United States or the Senate majority. The answer is simple: not much has been done. Last year, President Obama virtually ignored his own Deficit Reduction Commission. Now remember, in February 2010, the President appointed a lot of people to a Deficit Reduction Commission to give us a plan of what could be done about this fiscal situation that has happened so dramatically in the last 2 years. And there was no recognition in December when they reported that the President said that that's the thing that should be done in this country. So this year he did offer a budget, as he has to do under the budget law, in February the 14th of this year. And that budget would increase spending, increase taxes, and still add trillions to our debt. Now, everybody would think that a Democrat president suggesting a budget would be well received in a body that's controlled by the same political party. But that budget that he presented in February was so ill-conceived and out of touch that it was defeated here in the United States Senate by a vote of 97-0. Now let me emphasize that by saying not a single senator of either party voted for President Obama's budget. And, of course, that's very obvious that every member of the President's party said no to the President's budget. For the most of this year, President Obama said we should raise the debt ceiling without taking any measures to address our long-term deficits and debt. It was the position of this administration that Congress should simply rubber stamp another debt ceiling hike with no plan in place to reduce our deficits. That plan was voted on in the House and was soundly rejected there as well. All of the Republicans and nearly half of the Democrats in the other body voted against increasing the debt ceiling without deficit reduction. So it seems to me that we have a lot of bipartisan agreement when people say we have no bipartisan cooperation, that with the Senate's vote on the President's budget and in the other body, with nearly half of the Democrats opposing a debt ceiling without deficit reduction, that there's a clear understanding in a bipartisan way in the Senate that the President's budget spends too much, taxes too much, and leaves too much debt. And in the House of Representatives, there's a strong feeling that's bipartisan that if you're going to have a debt ceiling increase, there needs to be deficit reduction. So don't ever say that there's not bipartisan agreement, because it's been expressed in votes in both houses. The president then gave a budget speech in April, and I presume he recognized the inadequacy of his budget presented to Congress in February. He outlined a budget framework that would reduce that budget that was presented in February by $4 trillion over 12 years. So the president very quickly, in about 60 days, came to the conclusion that his budget was out of step with what people of even his own political party felt was necessary. So he could find $4 trillion to trim out of it. But you know what he hasn't done yet that a president ought to do in an environment where we have an executive budget process? He still hasn't presented the details of that budget. Now, the director of the Congressional Budget Office, that's Dr. Elmendorf, we all know, a person that is a devoted public servant to doing what's intellectually right all the time when he tries to help us decide how much money taxes are going to bring in or how much are going to be spent on a particular policy of Congress. Dr. Elmendorf was asked if he could estimate the budget impact of this new framework that came with the president's speech on April the 13th, which speech he came to the conclusion you ought to spend $4 trillion less than what he thought he could spend on Valentine's Day. And that's not necessarily a Valentine's gift in his February budget. And this is what the CBO director said in regard to that April 13th speech. He said, "We don't estimate speeches. We need much more specificity than was provided in that speech for us to do our analysis." But so far, the president hasn't provided those specifics. We've heard a lot from the White House about the need to come up with a plan when the president hasn't presented a plan. But the White House itself has never offered a single debt ceiling proposal for a vote. And the Senate Democratic leadership has also seriously shirked its responsibilities because, as I've said once before today, they haven't put forward a budget in more than 800 days, even though the law requires that they do it. Every family in America that works hard and sacrifices to pay their bills ought to be ashamed at the failure of the U.S. Senate to offer a budget in violation of the law. In sharp contrast, members of the House fulfilled their responsibility and passed a budget earlier this year. And so the very same majority party in this body that hasn't presented a budget for 800 days has done nothing in regard to the House budget but demagogue it. Well, they can't find time to compile their own budget. They've sure found time to make speeches that are derogatory about the House budget. And the House budget then obviously means that the House of Representatives did their responsibility under the law by presenting a budget and adopting a budget. While members on the other side come to the floor to oppose and demagogue the bill that I'm speaking about, the cut, cap, and balance bill, they've offered no plan of their own. While there is now a framework from the so-called Gang of Six, their plan also lacks any specificity. Perhaps that's the political strategy on the other side has chosen. Voters and the American people can't be upset with a position you've taken if you haven't taken a position. Just like a rule for political leaders, if you never get in trouble for a speech you don't give. Perhaps this strategy may be politically expedient, but it's going to drive our economy and our country off the cliff. The strategy of placing a higher priority on the next election rather than the economic and fiscal situation facing our country is how we got into this mess. Based on the lack of proposals put forth by the other side, one could assume that they're perfectly content borrowing 40 cents for every dollar that we spend. Are they pleased with the deficits of $1.5 trillion annually? Well, you could conclude they must be, because they haven't offered a plan to reduce the deficits. On top of that, they've argued for tax increases. They must believe that we have a revenue problem. According to their argument, the American people are not handing over enough of their money to satisfy the needs of Washington to spend. And I'm not sure you can ever tax high enough to satisfy the attitude here in Congress to spend money. In fact, if somebody would tell me, how much money do you really need from the American people to satisfy your appetite to spend, and I could get a limit on it, and it was a hard limit, I might even vote for it. Because I'd like to have people say they're finally satisfied, that government ought to be so big, but no bigger. But I never get those sort of broad statements here in the Congress. And so I've come to the conclusion that you can't raise taxes high enough to satisfy the appetite to spend money. But because we're borrowing money, the economy isn't growing and jobs aren't being created, is because Washington is spending too much money. Of course, the other side believes that the economy is not growing because we aren't spending enough money from Congress. Remember, just a few years ago, they passed the $800 billion so-called stimulus as a means to keep unemployment below 8%. That was early February 2009. That's when Speaker Pelosi said, yes, we wrote the bill, we won the election. So, employment shot above 8% right away, got up to over 10%, it's at 9.3%. So the promise of an $830 billion stimulus keeping unemployment under 8%, it just didn't work. So what do you do under those circumstances? You borrow money and spend it on government programs. And where is the U.S. economy today? Well, say it again, 9.2% unemployment. More than 14 million Americans out of work. And now the national debt is more than $14.3 trillion. This experiment, called the stimulus, proved that government spending does not stimulate private sector job growth. You know why? Because government consumes wealth. Government doesn't create wealth. The only jobs created by government are government jobs. They don't add value to the economy. They're a cost to the economy. Now, do you have to have government? Yes. Do you have to have government employees? Of course you have to have government employees. But to think you can hire more government employees and create wealth is false. The fact is, we're in a hole that we're in because of our spending problems, not because we don't have enough revenue coming in. Now look at this historically. Spending has averaged about 20% of our gross national product. And that's probably over 4 or 5 decades. Today, and in recent years, spending has grown now in the last couple of years to 25% of gross national product. This level of spending cannot be sustained, particularly when revenue has historically been around 18% of GDP. And to this very day, it's less than 18% because the economy is not growing, but a 50-year average is 18% of GDP. For my colleagues who think that we can reduce deficits by increasing taxes, they need to understand that it just doesn't work. Professor Vetter of Ohio University has studied tax increases and spending for more than 2 decades. In the late 1980s, he co-authored with Lowell Galloway, also of Ohio University, a research paper for a a committee of Congress called the Joint Economic Committee that found that every new dollar of new taxes led to more than $1 of new spending by the Congress. In other words, raise taxes $1, you think you'd go to the bottom line and reduce the deficit? But no, $1 coming in, you spend more than $1, so you make the deficit worse. Professor Vetter has now updated his study. Specifically, he found, and I quote, that, quote, over the entire post-World War II era through 2009, each dollar of new tax revenue was associated with $1.17 of new spending, end of quote. So, history proves tax increases result in spending increases. We know that increasing taxes is not then going to reduce the deficit. Instead of going to the bottom line, tax increases are a license for Washington to spend even more. History also shows that tax increases don't increase revenues. Everybody thinks that if you raise the marginal tax rate, you'll bring in more revenue. But the taxpayers, workers, and investors of this country are smarter than members of Congress are who believe that. Regardless of the rate, over the past 40 years, and I'm sorry I don't have a chart with me. I had a chart with me a week ago that demonstrated this, but if you listen closely, you'll get the message of the chart. Regardless of the rate of taxation, over the past 40 years, revenue has averaged, as I've said before, about 18% of gross domestic product. Higher tax rates just provide incentives for taxpayers to invest and earn money in ways that reduce their tax liability. You cannot tax your way out of this problem. We have a spending problem, not a revenue problem. That's why I'm supporting the only plan that has been put forth to address our deficit and debt problem. The Cut, Cap, and Balance plan passed the House with bipartisan support of 234 members. This plan is the only plan offered to cut spending in the near term. We need to halt and reverse the trend of the last 2 years when government spending increased by 22%, not even counting the failed stimulus program of another $830 billion. And you can't increase expenditures 22% when the growth of the economy is about 2%. It just doesn't add up, and that's how you get into trouble, and that's how we have increased a 50-year average of the national debt being about 35% of gross national product. After 2 years, it's now 65%, and it's on a path to go over 90%. And you know where Greece is right now when they're over 100%. It's going to lead to failure. And we're on that path right now, and we got to preempt that. It will also impose budget caps. This bill before us will impose budget caps to get our spending down to a manageable level compared to our gross domestic product. Finally, it would impose a balanced budget amendment to our Constitution, similar to what, I don't know whether it's 46 states or 49 states, but most states have a constitutional amendment requiring a balanced budget. And you know what? It works. You got to stop to think of a state that's as liberal as New York. If they can elect a liberal Democrat governor, and if he can cut to live within that constitutional requirement of a balanced budget, it ought to be something that we can do here in Washington, D.C. It's a discipline that works in the states. It's a discipline that we need through our Constitution. So when you take an oath to uphold the Constitution, the requirement of a balanced budget is something you swear to, and you'll see that you deliver on your promise to the American people. So it only makes sense to impose a requirement that we live within our means. Washington proves again and again that it needs this kind of discipline. I'd say to my colleagues, if you don't support this plan, then offer your own plan. You know that the debt limit must be increased, but you also know that we must take action to reduce the future levels of deficits and begin to bring our debt down. Where is your plan to do that? Where is your budget resolution that hasn't been presented in the last 800 or more days to the United States Senate, violating the budget law. How will you meet the responsibilities then of being elected to this office where you take an oath to uphold the laws and the Constitution of the United States? The trajectory of our debt is alarming. It will soon undermine our economy and our economic growth. If we do nothing, our children and grandchildren will have fewer economic opportunities than we have had. So this isn't just an economic issue. This is not just a fiscal issue. This is a moral issue of whether this generation, my generation, and people that are even younger than me but spending a lot of money, ought to live high in the hog and leave it to young people to pick up the bill. Without a plan to put our fiscal situation on a better path, the next generations will have lower quality of life than one we've experienced. We can't let that happen. We must take action to correct our course. I urge my colleagues to support the cut, cap, and balance plan. I yield the floor.